Welcome back, everybody. And if you weren't able to catch this morning's welcome, I'm Courtney Bryan, the Executive Director of the Center for Court Innovation. I'm thrilled to be able to moderate our first panel of the Community Justice Summit about how community justice can and must meet the new challenges that we face and embody the values that animate justice reform today. Some of these values include shrinking the footprint of the justice system through community-based solutions, empowering residents to co-create justice, and advancing racial equity and people-centered practices. I'm joined today, I'm so thrilled and I'm grateful to be joined today by 5 justice dynamos. So quickly to introduce them, Judge Alex Calabrese, the very recently retired presiding judge, although not really retired because here he is and he continues to be in our world, which is good, but recently officially retired presiding judge of the renowned Red Hook Community Justice Center in Brooklyn. District Attorney Alvin Bragg, New York County, so the Manhattan's district attorney, has been in office since January of this year. Dr. Thaddeus Johnson, Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Georgia State University. Lynn Richardson, the Chief Public Defender in Dallas County in Dallas, Texas. And Phil Bowen, Director of our sister organization here at the Center for Court Innovation, the Center for Justice Innovation, joining us from London, England today. Thank you again for joining me in this conversation. Before we get to questions for you all, I did want to just give a kind of quick backdrop for the conversation. About 30 years ago, a number of civic leaders, community members, and government policymakers embraced the term community justice to describe an alternative approach to the legal system that they saw often as remote, as bureaucratic, and as ineffective. These reformers were frustrated with the conventional legal system's inability to reduce crime, meet the needs of defendants and litigants that they were seeing, the needs of victims, the needs of communities, and end the frustration that they were not able to end. We weren't able to end the so-called revolving door of those charged with the low-level crimes who are coming in and out of the system without addressing the underlying needs that brought them into the system in the first place, like substance use, mental health needs, lack of housing and jobs. So community justice called for building trust and legitimacy with local stakeholders by involving the community and stakeholders in the planning and operations of justice, developing new measures of success. So not just looking at numbers, how many arrests police were making or how many cases judges were seeing, but actually tracking quality, including things like public confidence in the system, and adopting a problem-solving approach that focused on addressing community concerns rather than just processing cases with traditional outcomes like jail and fines. The Center for Court Innovation helped to develop some of the nation's first community justice initiatives, initially here in New York City, and then working with folks around the country. And we continue to help grow and adapt community justice for a new generation. The center's work here in New York has expanded from community courts to embrace a much broader array of community justice initiatives, such as the Brownsville Community Justice Center in Brooklyn, which is focused on economic development, youth entrepreneurship, placemaking, gun violence prevention. We're focused on access to justice and access to housing justice, specifically by co-locating those kinds of services in our community justice centers and throughout the city, and then developing an array of prevention programs as well. The Community Justice Today document that the center recently released as part of this session's materials, and it highlights the evolving work of community justice and 6 key values of community justice. 1, co-create justice. 2, advance equity. 3, put people first. 4, prioritize community-based solutions. 5, promote accountability. And 6, model innovation. And we're going to be discussing these principles and the evolution of community justice over the last 3 decades almost with the panelists today. So I'm going to start with a sort of quick rapid fire question, the same question for all of you. Wanting to look at how we can create some shared language around what community justice means. It's a broad phrase. How do we create some shared language? So let's start with each of you. What does community justice mean to you? And I'll start with Lynn, if that's okay with you. You're right next to me on the screen, so I'll start with you first.
Thanks a lot.
I knew you could handle it.
Hello, everyone. First of all, let me say what community justice means for me. And I know we're limited, and as a lawyer, you know, we can be long-winded, but I feel like I'm in hog's heaven because of, you know, the initiatives that we're discussing today. I got into this field. I decided to go to law school because I wanted to be a defense attorney. And that was because I wanted to make a change in the system. We all know about the inequities and the issues and the problems and how mass incarceration has affected communities of color. I was fortunate enough to be born into a family that believed in reaching out to communities and community service and taking care of those who haven't been able to take care of themselves, and saw very early on the intersection or the cause and effect of a lot of the people that were coming into the system, especially from some of the communities that we're talking about, Black and brown folk, poor people, and they're recycling in and out, coming in and out of the system, the revolving door, and recognize that it had a lot to do with their environment, where they were coming from, the communities they were born and raised in, where their families lived. And then obviously now we know what we know in terms of incarceration, that it does not reduce crime. It does not allow people to rehabilitate. In fact, it makes them worse. And then when they come back to those communities that are having challenges, they don't have resources, they don't have opportunities, that it ends up where they're coming back in and out of the system over and over again. And the need to build those systems. I'm also old enough to remember that a lot of the communities that we're dealing with were communities at one time, years ago, were very thriving communities. They had businesses, they had families. And because of the infestation of drugs, problems with healthcare, mental illness, poverty, lack of educational opportunities, but especially drugs, a lot of those communities ended up in the situation that they were in. And also recognizing, which is obvious to everyone, that depending on your background, and it doesn't mean that people that don't come from wealthy backgrounds don't commit crimes, but we do know what the statistics and the research says about that. So we take a client-centered, holistic approach to criminal defense in our office, but we were doing that way before it became popular to do so, because we recognized in order to make a change that we're going to have to reach out and partner and collaborate with those communities. So that's why I'm all on board and so excited about all of the initiatives. And I just have to say thanks to the judge for all his hard work and what he has done, and everybody on this call.
Thank you, Lynn. Yeah, the kind of community solutions as opposed to system solutions. It sounds like that's a big theme of what community justice means for you. So you mentioned the judge, so let's turn to you, who happens to be next to you on the screen, on my screen. Judge Calabrese, what does community justice mean to you?
Thank you, Courtney and Lynn. Well, I think it's court and community working together. It's the court being an active part of the community to solve problems. And I think it's especially these days, it's the community having a say in the role of the police and police involvement, what the community wants to try to handle in other ways and what they want the police to handle. It's a court which sees everyone who comes to the door as part of the community before they had a case, while it's pending, and when the case is over. I think there are 3 features of a community court. One is procedural justice, which is absolutely critical. It's then procedural justice. I know we have a lot of people on this, is treating people with respect, giving them a voice and listening to them. I'd like to ask, for example, what's a good day for you to come back to court? First of all, because we don't want a person to lose their job because the court just happens to pick a day convenient to the court. We all lose when someone loses their job. But what you get out of that question is so much. It means you're telling that person, we respect you, we respect your time, we know you have obligations outside of the court. You're going to have a voice in what happens in court, and you're going to have a say in the final resolution of the case, all out of one question. And procedural justice can be used to ensure accountability. And I think that's really important because accountability does not have to equal jail. It can include conversations between the court and the accused. They actually can be pretty powerful and effective. Essay writing, community work, court observation, peacemaking. And two, a community court wants the accused to have a successful experience. This is completely opposite the approach of the traditional court, which is really us versus them. And successful can mean using needed services to resolve a case and get their life back on track, or having a trial where they feel that they were treated fairly throughout that process. And I think representatives of a community court have to attend community meetings to learn what services are needed by the community and adapt those services as the community needs change. And a community court should be and is part of the fabric of the community. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, like you said, this is sort of involving the court. It's not an alternative to court. In many ways, it's including the court. Dr. Johnson, same question. What is community justice to you?
Yeah, thank you so much for, first of all, just having me here. I'm honored to be part of this panel. And Lynn, thank you for, you and the judge. And Lynn, thank you for the personal story. And I think I'll kind of start there before I just really tell you what community justice means. Now, as a Black man, a former officer, and now a researcher who looks at equity issues, I think I represent an intersection of what community justice really stems from. And I'll share a quick story. As a police officer, I never arrested anyone that didn't look like me. I worked in Memphis. The first arrest I made was the man's address, the street behind my grandma's house. And so at some point when I became a supervisor, I realized that, yeah, we need officers' accountability, but for me, it's not the type of change I wanted to impact. Limited. And so I think, I've always had a community justice mind frame before I even knew how to label it, right? And so for me, when I think about a community justice system, it's a depoliticized justice that centers leadership and the human condition. When I think of community justice, I think of a system that sees the beauty in redeeming human potential and not destroying it. I think one misnomer about community justice is that it's not about accountability. It's nothing but about accountability. So for me, community justice is accountability, but also aftercare, after we've held people accountable. It's also accountability not only for police actions, for actions they are service providers, but also accountability on the community aspect of it. Because when we ask the center communities, we also ask them to take on the burden of additional responsibility, right? And so with that comes like working with law enforcement. We have to bridge that gap of trust, reporting crimes, reporting incidents when people need help and are hurting in communities, not turning a blind eye. It's alternatives to traditional enforcement. It's even adversarial partnerships and collaborations. It keeps each other honest. It ensures that each voice is represented. It's not about friendships, it's about relationships. Also, it's about attention to the human fears and needs of the community, service providers and justice system actors. For instance, many of the young Black men who carry weapons in our urban communities, if you look at some research, it's not because they want to be killers. They're simply afraid. It's a survival mechanism. So I was one of those. I was an honor student. I still carry something because I grew up in South Memphis. We didn't trust the police. We didn't trust these things. And so it's really understanding the issues that these communities are facing. Also, things like affordable living. Also, it's having an appetite for uncomfortable conversations, uncomfortable innovation. And finally, for me, a community justice system means we redefine what winning means in our justice system. As a police officer, winning is making arrests, writing tickets. Many of them don't have public safety value. As a prosecutor, you're judged by how many cases that you're able to win or get victory, whatever you want to call it, right? What's winning, right? Has that helped? And so community justice for me is redefining on what we deal and call winning in our justice system. Now shut up and stop treating.
That's great. I love that, redefining winning. Phil, tell us about community justice and for you and your perspective, and people will hear that you have a different viewpoint when you open your mouth with your accent.
Thank you, Courtney, and thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be on a panel with such an august group of people. And next time I'm more than happy to travel, so just let me know and I'll come over. I guess for me, and I guess for a British audience, the word community justice can have 2 or 3 different meanings. One meaning for us is just, it's all the interactions the justice system has with citizens outside of the prison walls. So it's pre-court disposals, it's alternatives to remand, it's community sentencing, it's re-entry of people back from prison into their communities. So it involves police, youth workers, probation, treatment services, employment services, accommodation providers. And for us at the Centre for Justice Innovation, we work on community justice because it's the bulk of what the justice system does. Our not-for-profit sector and even our government officials can be myopically focused on what happens in prison, who goes to prison, what prison conditions are like. And while that's obviously extraordinarily important, we work on, the injustice of things like fining people who can't afford to pay their fines. The fact that we prosecute people for possession of drugs when we know there's a better interaction between the police and those communities, which involves drugs education. So one interpretation for us is simply, it's everything that happens outside of prison. I think, again, to British ears, community justice means something about where power sits in the justice system. Who's making decisions, who's making policy choices, and where are those choices being made? In the UK, we traditionally have a very centralised justice system where a lot of the decision making, a lot of the policy making is made in the capital in London. And I think a British audience would hear the phrase community justice and think about things like devolving power down to a local level. So at the moment, for example, we've got a national prison service. In a community justice prison service, you may well devolve power further down to communities. And that, I guess, links to another interpretation of the phrase, which is about justice that actually involves, engages with, and is shaped by its own communities. We have slightly strange traditions in England and Wales of community justice in that sense. We have a magistracy, which is a set of lay people. They are not legally trained, and yet they sit as magistrates in our courts. It's a tradition that goes back to 1374, and they preside over cases and they dole out justice, and they can even dole out 6 months of prison. Now that's sort of involving the communities, but I think it would be fair to say our magistrates are not as representative of our communities, especially our communities that have low levels of trust in the justice system. So we don't do nearly enough to reach out to those communities. So I think, again, a British audience, community justice is about trying to bridge the gap between our communities and the justice system. And it's definitely an area in which we work quite hard to look at how we can better involve communities in justice. And then I guess, lastly, community justice means what a number of people have said on this call, which is a more ideological mindset, which is about moving away from a focus on punishment, a focus on catching, convicting, and punishing, towards a more problem-solving, more procedurally fair, more anti-racist, more compassionate justice system, a justice system that sees the person and not just the case, that sees justice and contact with the justice system as a window of opportunity to change lives and transform communities. And that's really the work that sort of informs the last 10 years of our work here at the Centre for Justice Innovation, about how do we help police forces, for example, divert people away from court prosecution. So I think to British ears, it means a lot of things all at one time.
Thank you. And finally, DA Bragg.
Thanks. So great to be here with you. Courtney, and with CCI. So for us, a lot of times being community means working with CCI. We partner a whole lot, and we really appreciate that here at the DA's office. I would say overarching from a prosecutor's office, it's a view that we can't do this alone, right? That we are not the end all, be all, and that if we're going to get real, true, enduring safety, it's got to be in partnership with our civic groups, our faith leaders, our little league coaches, everything that goes into making a community, and that comes with a heavy dose of listening. So Courtney mentioned I've been in office for about 9 months now. I very consciously and affirmatively spent a lot of that time out of the office, out in communities and listening. And I've also tried, to the extent we can with COVID restrictions, to invite people in, both physically or virtually, and then more broadly, kind of thinking about how we're staffing. We're recently hiring someone who is has re-entered, and making sure the community is also within in our four walls. In addition to that, I would say investments. We've talked a lot about mental health this year, and we're looking about ways to sort of really plug holes in our mental health system, both sort of the court process with the limited number of cases we can by contract right here in our mental health court. So advocating for expansion of that, but more broadly, advocating for people asking me what's the number one thing we can do on safety? Like, we need more supportive housing, right? Or we need a third lane, I call it, between pretrial detention or jail or prison and out in community, place where people are getting services. So advocating for that. And then in terms of sort of more concrete examples, we've used some of our forfeiture funding this year, for example, on gun grants to 10 locally based, community-based organizations who are working directly with youth who are at risk for gun violence, and putting money in their hands to in turn be put in the hands of our youth during the summer months where we know really crime and gun violence can spike. That was one of really my favorite days as DA so far. And then another example, which is closer to our enforcement work, so I like it because it shows that we can sort of do our traditional work and also engage in community. So we did a very serious violence investigation, used our traditional powers to enforce the law. We felt that people needed to be prosecuted and taken out of community. But then as we were taking the case down, we said, look, there are these names that keep on coming up. It was a wiretap investigation and long-term investigation. These names that keep on coming up for folks who don't have any criminal culpability, but we know from our experience, specifically from my life experience, having grown up in Central Harlem, that if we didn't do anything, we would see those same names on an indictment in a couple of years if history is any guide. And so we, sort of very quietly, without fanfare, connected with our cure violence groups and said, look, we know y'all out here working every day. You may know these folks already, but if you don't, here's a list of folks that we respectfully suggest you take a look at and help and link and support them. And the nature of that is really kind of hands off. It's like it's a literal kind of don't let us know what we're going to do. But I have had an opportunity to get some feedback on that when I've seen some of our partners, and they said, look, keep on doing that, because that's going to make a difference. It's going to make all of us safer. It's going to not be a panacea, not going to be something that's be tomorrow, but over the long term, if we keep on partnering in that way with that kind of handoff, we're going to reduce incarceration and improve safety, which are obviously our twin goals.
Thank you. Yeah, looking outside of kind of the traditional role is for everybody, is how I think critical for advancing community justice. Okay, so I'm going to ask now some specific questions to each of you. We're going to kind of move into talking about evolution and how community justice has evolved and can evolve, and what's needed to do that. And so I'll start with you, Judge Calabrese. As we've said, you've been the judge, recently retired, served on the bench in Red Hook for over 20 years. You were at the ground floor of this movement, community justice movement. How has the role of the court and the judge evolved during that 20 years? What kind of does co-creating justice now in 2022 look like? And how has it evolved from what it looked like in 2000?
I think it really starts with CCI, Courtney, as our partner at the Justice Center. When we started, we were inundated with substance abuse cases, with crack cocaine. We had to address those. We addressed those needs. We had services available. Youth programming became more important. Housing has become much more important over the years. And I guess what I loved about working with, first of all, let me just say, I always felt like I was an experimental pilot, that I got to use all these services. And the services I had nothing to do with creating. They were created by CCI throughout. So I really felt lucky to be there. But I could bring all these tools to a situation. And recently, we've had peacemaking, the most innovative and effective program that I've seen in over 40 years in the justice system. I would just say on a broader scope, with social justice at the forefront, more courts are being created, and they're created sometimes on the national model, but more often on the local model, the county next to them. The state of Washington just keeps multiplying courts because they see it being effective. And they're created to address a local issue that's important to the community. Sometimes maybe it's just one or two issues: the unhoused, substance abuse issues, mental health issues. Obviously, mental health are concerns everywhere, and trying to find services is a concern. And they're different models, and I guess that's what I love about it. Whatever fits the community, because the community wants services, they want it now. They don't want jail, and so the models goes from something like Red Hook, which is a freestanding court, to a courtroom in a traditional court building, to the library model. People are so creative and delivering services, and that's because they have a drive to do so. And I would say with jurisdictions using incarceration less, procedural justice and fairness becomes more important. And it's important that the court build the reputation for caring about the community and providing services. And you can do that. One way you can do that is by offering services on a walk-in basis. Give people a hub of services if you can, or at least a place where they can go and start asking questions to address the particular problem they're walking in the door with. I think it's important for the judge and court staff to be visible in the community, because you want to bridge the gap between court and community. And if you want the community coming in your door, you have to go out to the community. And what's happening is that people who work in these courts find that they're making a difference in their community and in the lives of the people who come through their door and the people that they serve. And others in the justice system are noticing, and they're noticing community courts and what they provide.
I was going to just offer to thinking about, you mentioned housing and restorative justice. So again, looking at what the origins of Red Hook, which were, I think, obviously focused on alternatives to incarceration, but looking at treatment as a very much needed response, and sort of individual response, very directly related to someone often coming through the system, looking more broadly at solutions and tools like the housing and the connection there, and then restorative justice looking outside of kind of even more traditional alternative to incarceration approaches, with restorative justice. That I definitely have seen that personally, that evolution in Red Hook over the last few years. Thank you.
It's driven by the community, Courtney.
Right.
It's driven by community needs, and CCI picks up on it.
Well, thank you for the kind words about the CCI, and we in Red Hook play a role that I know a number of folks who are on this call or on this part of the summit play in other communities, which is kind of helping to be service provider partner in community justice programs around the country. DA Bragg, your jurisdiction includes the Midtown Community Court, and as you just talked about, your platform and kind of focus has really been trying to make jail, the use of jail, a last resort, advancing both safety and justice, which is obviously central to a lot of to community justice models. thinking about you're a new state prosecutor, a sort of next generation of prosecutors. How do you think your generation of prosecutors, how do you need to, what do you need to be doing to advance community justice, and what do you need to be doing differently? You gave a few examples in your previous answer, but I'm curious if you could talk more about what prosecutors need to do differently.
Sure, and I will. I'll use an example of a CCI alum. We've just started a new division. Really, kind of, you mentioned the Midtown Court. With that type of diversion or alternative incarceration in mind. For felonies as well. What we saw in Manhattan was we have and have had for some time. Alternatives incarceration courts, mental health court, which I mentioned earlier, felony alternative incarceration as well, and also drug diversion. But what we were seeing is that a lot of that, those cases were ending up there very defense-driven and late in the cycle of cases, right? So after motion practice, when something couldn't be resolved by plea, and at that point, someone, if they're in custody, has been in custody for 6, 9 months, even a year, and then the documents start to get compiled, and it's 18 months, and then we're talking about programming. This work in the office was sort of ancillary to the sort of trial and plea work. So we've started a division called Pathways to Public Safety, which is headed by a CCI alum, on the thesis of we need to be doing this work from the very beginning. So we now have, we're now fully, well, I can't say fully staffed up, but we are now operationally staffed up. We have, 6 deputies who are sort of embedded in our trial division bureaus, which sort of do most of our street crimes work. And they're charged with, at the earliest stage, literally, right after arraignment, looking at a case and saying, okay, is this a case that should be diverted? And so they're bringing to bear, these are people who have deep expertise in alternative incarceration. And I would say that's the other parts of the three-legged stool. So the expertise, timing, they're doing it early so that we don't have someone who needs mental health, and that's a way to resolve a case that sits in pretrial detention for 6 months with their mental health deteriorating. So expertise, timing, and then consistency. We're a big office. We have 500 assistant attorneys. And so a key focus of us is getting some type of normalization, realizing that obviously every case and every human is different, but making sure that we're, to the extent possible, treating like cases and like people alike. And so we're, as you mentioned from the top, about 9 months in, and I'd say the last kind of couple of months we've been operational on this and getting our sea legs. But for me, this is a signature endeavor, and I think has the potential really to dramatically change our practice in Manhattan. Just by way of data, this year we have increased our use of felony alternative incarceration about 250% compared to last year. And so much so that, as you know, Courtney, we have to have, I think, good but hard conversations about resources. We need more resources for this, both in my office and the service providers are doing the hard work under the supervision of CCI, and obviously also with the court. So to me, that's the really, when I look about what we're going to do here over the next 3 years, that's a focal point.
Thank you. And 2 things I would pull out from that. One is it's like you said, sort of institutionalizing and you mentioned this, Judge Calabrese, too, the sort of evolution. Some of these ideas are born in pilots, small efforts, community justice, community courts, for example. And then this is about taking some of those values and practices and making more systemic change in the centralized court. And then the other evolution is about kind of seeing the success of focusing on lower level cases and seeing we could do more with, opening to look at felony cases as well, and that there are opportunities to apply the same principles and approaches and connection to services for felony cases, which is, I think, not what community, the origins of community court didn't contemplate thinking about those kinds of cases. So that's, definitely an evolution that is exciting to hear about. Lynn, I wanted to turn to you. kind of a similar question around, well, for those of you who don't know, Dallas is just a shining star. The community courts in Dallas are real examples to the field. As the chief public defender, I guess two questions. One, how has it transformed your work and the kind of the lives of clients? And then the same question for you, what do you think that defense attorneys need to do differently to kind of be active, valuable participants in community justice?
Thanks for mentioning Dallas, and I'd like to give kudos to the city of Dallas. My first exposure to community courts was through the South Dallas Drug Court, Community Drug Court, which I believe is a mentor court with Center of Court Innovation. And I was actually the attorney, even though I was heading up the office, that decided to represent the individuals in the program because I wanted to see what the program was all about. And we're very fortunate here in Dallas that we have not only a very robust community court group, but we also have drug courts, specialty courts, problem-solving courts, diversion programs. And it's been a journey because when I first came here 27 years ago, we did not have that. We were utilizing the traditional forms of managing and resolving cases in the criminal justice system. I would like to say that I think the push for Dallas County has been, and it may be the initiative behind a lot of programs of this nature. I would love to say that everybody that it got on board and subsequently became involved did it because they wanted to see change and they recognized what we were doing wasn't working. But I think it was out of necessity. Dallas Texas in general had all these prisons and they were building more prisons and they just couldn't sustain that, and so you have people on both sides of the aisle decide we got to do something else because we can't afford to just, build more prisons and house individuals. We've heard a number of comments about mental health. We have the second largest jail in the state. At any given time, we have in excess of 5,000 people, and a conservative estimate is a quarter of those individuals suffer from a serious mental illness. In my opinion, that is more of a public health issue, but they have placed that responsibility on the criminal justice system. And so now we're sort of like the largest, our jail is one of the largest mental health hospitals in the state because of that. Resources being a problem. And so everybody began to recognize whatever their motivation was that we got to do something different. And I think that was the driving force behind a lot of the programs that got started. And then I think people started doing the deep dive and looking at Red Hook and other initiatives, what Center for Court Innovation was doing, and said, yeah, this looks like it's working. And the other thing I want to comment on is one of the best things I like about this is that we're not afraid to look at what we're doing, the flexibility, the assessments, looking at collecting the data, seeing what it says, and making changes, not only to identify those things that work, but looking at things that don't work and trying to correct that. So not just changing for change's sake, but because we see we've got to do a better job doing that. And then to answer your question regarding the defense bar, I have to say that it's been a struggle. As a public defender, I'm in a better position to look at, what are the outcomes? What are we doing for our clients? Are we keeping them from coming back in the system? But to be quite honest, there has been resistance, and there was, especially in the very beginning, from the defense bar that say, that's not my job. My job is to represent them on their criminal case. It's not my job to get them drug treatment. It's not my job to encourage them to take their medication. And quite frankly, there are some who feel like, well, why do I want them to get better? Because that's how I make my money. They keep reoffending over and over and over again, then that's more money. I represent them. I represent their families. But fortunately, we've been able to convince some individuals that this does work and it does come up, especially when you're dealing with people who don't have money. If you've got a retained client that's paying you, yeah, there's a motivation to get a good outcome, because if they have any issues in the future, they'll be able to come back to you. But especially when dealing with the indigent population, that has been a challenge. So we continue to try to expose others to this and to encourage them. I can't say that we're winning the battle on every end, but I'm positive that, or I have a positive attitude about that, that hopefully we'll be able to convince people, because at the end of the day, we all benefit from this. If people don't keep cycling in and out of the system, if we're able to get them on the right track, get a job, get a skill, take care of their families, pay taxes, guess what? All of us benefit from that. Society benefits from that. And hopefully we'll continue to do it. And one last thing, one of the things that we benefited from here in Dallas County is that, and I think it's something that Thaddeus mentioned early, we meet with our partners, not just in the criminal justice system, but our partners in the community, with mental health and substance use providers on a monthly basis. We meet with our bosses, who are the commissioners. We meet with probation. We meet with the DA's office. We have a number of different collaborative efforts where we work together. We don't always have to agree, but we're all working and communicating. And we've been a lot more successful in moving forward with programs and projects, because we've been able to have that kind of collaboration.
Thank you. Dr. Johnson, so you've spent a lot of your career, especially broadly on justice reform, but particularly thinking about your work around law enforcement. And I'm curious to hear what you think the opportunities are for community justice to be an answer to some of the cries for reforming police practice, and what value you see in law enforcement and sort of unique opportunities there are for them for transformation by their involvement in community justice.
No, thank you again. And I will just first off to say the justice system, in particular policing, it was established as a punishing and blaming institution, right? That's been asked to do things that have been beyond really their pay grade, right? Prime example is police officer. One of the saddest things that broke my heart was, as an officer, I didn't receive any training on how to deal with persons with going through mental health episodes, or someone who's dealing with deep substance abuse. Right now, it's been 10 years or so since I've been out the game. But the one thing that broke my heart was dealing with someone that I knew was going through something that was related to the human condition, and I'm forced to make a decision on whether they should be admitted into a mental health care services or substance abuse services. And if they don't meet certain criteria, I have to make a decision. If they need medication, do I arrest them and hope that I take them to jail, that they're able to get the treatment that they're needed, knowing the risk of victimization, knowing the risk and how susceptible they are to risk opposed to others. That was heartbreaking. That's one of the reasons why, I think I might have went ahead and molded on out of that career field, and I'm where I'm at right now. And so what I've seen now is that law enforcement has been taking a trauma-informed approach, right? They've been partnering with, they understand the limits of their power, and they've been partnering, like in places with Dallas and the STARS program, where you have service providers and officers in plain clothes who go out and answer calls. It shows that there was less use of force, officers were less likely to be injured, right? And they were able to peacefully resolve these issues. Arrests went down, right? And people got treatment. In Denver, where you have clinicians and paramedics partnering to answer these same types of calls that are funneled through 911. And even what we found in Denver is that police officers, up to a third of those calls, the police officers referred them. So you see that these officers have more tools, and even things with Newark, where the police officers and communities talk about trauma. There's trauma on both sides. And I think now what it allows us to do when you take a trauma-informed approach, it builds empathy on both sides. It now allows law enforcement to develop even age-appropriate, we don't talk about juveniles and developmental issues, but even come with age-appropriate type of responses that also reduce race-based community trauma with additional arrests, or even places like Atlanta where things like marijuana arrests, we make it like a traffic ticket as opposed to an actual offense, where in a place like here, we look at the parole board, a marijuana arrest traditionally has carried the same weight and parole risk instruments. We talk about that, than non-lethal assaults. Well, if you're differentially exposed to police, then you're going to have a lengthier record. And now criminal race is now a proxy for criminal history. We're understanding those things in particularly. You're also seeing where we're providing mental health care for officers and service providers. How can people who are not well take care of communities? And we're realizing that people, service providers, officers are people. I'll shout out Dallas. They created this mental health leave right now for firefighters and for police. They had to fight for it, but they got it, right? At the end of the day, they got it, right? And we're taking understanding mental health and that healthcare and that people are really people. And then also in places like San Francisco, where we have a sex industry. We won't talk about the motivations for there, but there's a lot of victimization. People are victimized in silence, and there's fear of prosecution. They remove those barriers. The same thing for undocumented residents who are afraid of deportation, who are often victimized in silence. You're a human being, and we care about your condition. We don't care about the legalities of it. You're seeing cities move in that direction across the U.S. and seeing partnering with Atlanta pretrial arrest diversion initiatives, where if there's a person who's unhoused, who's dealing with poverty, who's dealing with these issues, they're provided services outside of law enforcement. And these community members, these are publicized to community members and business owners. And so they're not unnecessarily put into this pathway. And so those are just some of the things that I've really seen, is that the trauma-informed approach and really taking mental health care seriously, both in the community and also for those who are providing services.
Thank you. Phil, last before we go to we're going to go to a really rapid round question on the future of justice in a second, before we can have time for Q&A, because we do have a few good questions. But Phil, I wanted to ask you, hearing the community justice work happening here in the US, what resonates and what's different in the UK? I mean, in your first answer, you gave kind of a sense of what community justice, the different iterations of that definition in the UK, but give us a little more flavor for kind of where you see similarities, where do you see some differences, and maybe an example of what kind of co-creating justice looks like across the pond.
Yeah, I guess lots of similarities in I think we're all tackling the same kinds of issues. So a good example is in England and Wales, we have spent a lot of time, my organisation spent a lot of time working with police forces to increase the use of pre-court disposals, i.e. not putting people through court prosecution. And we've got to a point where we've got a number of police forces that are so keen on it that we're actually having to pull them back from doing too much with people who really haven't done that much in terms of offending, and they're trying to overdose people. And so we're beginning to sort of try to, while they're on board with the program, we're trying to make sure that they're not trying to use the justice system to leverage in too many interventions. And another kind of resonance as well is tackling racial disparities around minoritized communities coming through the system. So there was a big review in the UK back in 2016 about the issues we have about disproportionality in the justice system. That's led to lots of positive activity. We have, for example, a youth justice system, so for all of our under 18s, which is now the smallest youth justice system we've had for 30 years. We've got fewer kids in custody, fewer kids coming through the courts. And yet we find, and I think this is similar to what some people have said today, we find still disproportionate amounts of people from our minoritized communities within our institutions. There are fewer of them, but we still have those disproportionalities, and that's still an issue. There are some really positive green shoots at the moment over this side of the Atlantic. We've got a growth of problem-solving courts. People like Alex have been over here at various points in the past 10 years banging the drum for problem-solving courts, and it's beginning to happen. We've had our Scottish colleagues relatively recently, 3 or 4 years ago, passed a really radical piece of legislation which essentially said judges should have a presumption against sending anyone to prison for less than 12 months, because we know that doesn't work. It just dislocates their lives. So there are loads of really positive things, and I think there are similarities. I think sort of on the negative side of the ledger, we still do not do enough in terms of involving and engaging communities in justice. I think that part of the work has really not taken off in the UK. And I think we also are still stuck, and I don't know what it's like in the States, but stuck with a political conversation, which far too often is about sentence lengths and looking tough. So our prison population, fewer people are going to prison, but they are the ones that are going there for longer. Those numbers have got worse over the past 10 years. And the public remain unconvinced that our system is tough enough. So it's the easiest thing for a politician to say, I'm going to crack down on crime. I'm going to do nasty things to people who are nasty to you. And that we still haven't been able to reframe the conversation around justice. But I think there are some really positive things that are happening. And I think the last note, which again, a number of speakers have said, is I think there's a growing recognition within the criminal justice professional community that we don't have and shouldn't have all the answers. So we know, for example, that one of the best things we can do in terms of our resources is if we tackle homelessness, we tackle some of our justice problems. That doesn't require justice professionals being involved at all. So we should be shifting money from the justice system to things like that. And I think there is a recognition of that, and that's positive as well.
Thank you. So I'm gonna forego the next question actually, and see if we have some time at the end, and then I'll ask you for your responses on it. But I'm gonna just make a comment about that, which what was going to be the topic, which is the future of community justice, and just sort of hearing what you all are talking about. A few things come out to me, and then I'm going to turn it to Q&A. One is just tackling racial disparities, that, just how do we ensure that we're not just looking at reducing the population and not taking a look at who's actually being served and who is continuing to be disproportionately impacted. And obviously that's frequently in the US, Black and Brown Indigenous communities. The second is about sort of deepening the resident and those who are directly impacted by the system, their engagement in community justice. So not just those who are residents and kind of already civically engaged, but how do we go deeper, I think, is the future of community justice as well. And looking at impacted people's leadership, not just kind of being consulted, but really being centered more in community justice. And then I think kind of inspired by DA Bragg talking a bit, and we too, I know in Red Hook, looking at violence. I think what role, as we fortunately are reducing the jail population and prison population, looking at who will remain, and the reality that many people charged with violence, we still are struggling with what is the response there other than prison. And so what role, if any, can community justice play, I think, in that area is something that I would point out. Is if we were having this panel in 10 years, I think we'd be talking about those issues. Okay, so I want to turn to some questions that we've gotten. The first one is actually sort of related to something that a comment I made, which is community justice means having those closest to harm shaping policies. How can you help impacted communities if they don't have a voice? So I'm curious to hear those of you who would offer a reflection there, and potentially examples of how you or others that you know are bringing in impacted communities to have a voice in shaping community justice or shaping the justice system's response. I'm
happy to dive in.
Thank you.
It's been something we've been focused on here. So we've haven't formally launched, but are working with a group of people who are formerly incarcerated as a Reentry Council to help us on that issue, but more broadly as an advisory group. And I sat in on the first session, and I like it's out of the same division I mentioned pathways earlier. It was a CCI alum the way it's been set up is there are a few members identified initially, and then they're helping to round out the rest of the group. And we'll be looking to them for guidance and input. I mentioned that we just hired someone in the DA's office who's formerly incarcerated and reentered, looking out into sort of the medium term, the long term. I know as we swore in 70 assistant district attorneys about a month ago. I was involved in hiring some of those as we're doing our next class, which will start in the fall of 2023. I'm interviewing. I'm very consciously looking for people who've had some engagement with the system. Obviously, I'm trying not to be intrusive. I'm trying to be obviously very appropriate interviews, but when it comes up, people who've either been a survivor or witness, they've been stopped by the police. They know public safety issues directly. They know the unfairness directly. To me, that is bringing the voice inside in a very, very meaningful way to have the person who's going to be, in court representing the office and the people of the state of New York having personally experienced these issues. And then we're also we engaged a consultant to help us sort of assess how best to launch or really expand, but I would say relaunch restorative justice efforts, which would be another way to bring in community input in the resolution of cases. So those are some of the things that we're doing and that have kind of a non-exhaustive list, but ways of kind of bringing community voices within, very much based on the premise that those who have experienced this have insights that others do not.
Thank you. And anyone else want to answer that question?
I would just say if you and everyone working at the courthouse have constant contact with the community, you're getting constant feedback. And when there's a great relationship between court and community, they're going to let you know when there are particular issues. I mean, we cover housing for the Red Oak houses, 6,600 people. And when you're attending community meetings, you're going to hear about issues. And I've had people call me about stop and frisk. I've had teenagers which discuss with the police. I've had teenagers talk to me about literally being hassled by the police, which we discussed immediately with the police. But you're getting that because you're in the community. So I think that's really critically important.
Thank you. And Lynn, I saw you come off and then we'll go to another question.
Yes, I just agree with both the judge and with DA Bragg, the use of formerly incarcerated individuals, also peers. We do a lot of work with peers in a lot of our programs. And then we engage them on advocating for certain bills to be passed and legislative initiatives and working with nonprofits. For example, NAMI, the National Association of Mental Illness. We work with board members in some of those very same communities, the southern sector. And we work on, going and testifying in Austin when there are bills that we are supporting that and basically looking for more funding for mental illness and all of these other issues as well.
Thank you. This is a question for you, DA Bragg, which is about disparities and sort of the comment was, my experience is that marginalized communities, especially Black folks, never benefit as much from others from these exit valves. So wanting to know, if are you looking at disparities? And then a related question was, what are the front end alternatives that you referenced in your previous comments?
So we are trying to be very data informed and measure, let's say, two things. I sort of alluded to this when I talked about sort of normalization and treating like cases and like people alike. So that's very much a kind of working premise. But we know we have to track it. So we're relatively new. This is one thing we want to sort of track to make sure that we are actually doing what I said, kind of treating like people and like cases alike. The other thing that we're going to track and trying to come up with a robust ways is efficacy. I mean, I graduated from law school in 1999, and one way or another been engaged in criminal laws since then. And I know, particularly in a prior iteration as a federal prosecutor, it was one program that we sent people to a lot And I had a judge ask me one time, so like, do we actually know that, like, what's happening there? And so tracking efficacy, right? And making sure that we're getting the results. Well, mindful that obviously, we know people are going to have setbacks and they're not looking for easy solutions, but making sure that the programs are doing what we're expecting them to do. So efficacy and certainly disparities on what we're tracking. And in terms of sort of the valves or the ramps, they're I would say our biggest areas are substance use disorder treatment, mental health treatment. Those are the sort of top two, but there are other kind of just supportive systems. Sometimes it's anger management treatment. Sometimes it's literally sort of kind of executive functioning skill. People work with people on sort of the whole spectrum of what goes into sort of, moving forward to a different chapter of life. But the two biggest areas, I'd say particularly now, the one that I think about the most is mental health. Mental health treatment, our mental health board is for kind of severe mental illness, but I think we see it in almost every case. There's a mental health component.
Thank you. So we are 1 minute past. There were a couple of other questions that I'll just note because I think maybe in follow-up materials, we can send out information related to, again, about how the programs and innovations that we talked about here, how folks are addressing disparities. So there's clearly a lot of interest and well-deserved attention on ensuring that we're reducing, eliminating ultimately disparities. And then another was about how we identify, or you all identify, gaps and needs to be responsive, as the judge was mentioning earlier. That's how we evolve, is based on that. So I know that the Center for Court Innovation, we have some materials on this and can source some answers to that for be in the follow-up potentially to the conference. I want to thank the panelists. It's a tall order to have to be on a panel with 5 people, 6 people, and get through an hour when there's so much to say. Thank you very much for your wisdom and joining us today, and thank you to the audience for your engagement and work. And I will turn it over to the next speaker for the next session. Thank you.